Hello, my name is Sarah Jefford and I am a family creation lawyer practicing in Australia. I practice in surrogacy and donor conception, and I've also been a surrogate and an egg donor and was an IVF mum. So today I'm going to talk to you about traditional surrogacy. There's a lot of myths around surrogacy, particularly in Australia, where lots of people still think it's not legal. There are two types of surrogacy: gestational surrogacy, which is where the surrogate is not providing the egg that fertilizes with sperm and hopefully becomes pregnant. Gestational surrogacy often involves an egg from one of the intended parents, or it might be from an egg donor. Traditional surrogacy is different because it involves the surrogate's own egg, and she conceives with her own egg and genetic material. So she is also the genetic parent of the child that she gives birth. It's not very common. In Australia, we know that it's about 15% of all surrogacy arrangements are traditional surrogacy. And it means that the vast majority involve gestational surrogacy. And most intended parents will have their own eggs or have an egg donor involved and won't need a traditional surrogate. But having said that, there's lots of surrogates out there that will do traditional surrogacy for all sorts of reasons. Myself, I started as a gestational surrogate. That's what I wanted to do. But we switched to traditional surrogacy when we worked out that it was more viable for me to conceive with my own egg. It is absolutely legal to do traditional surrogacy across Australia, except in the ACT. So we hear lots of people saying you can do surrogacy, but you're not allowed to conceive with your own egg. That is absolutely not true for the most part in Australia. In Victoria, we have a specific law that says that you can do traditional surrogacy, but you can't access the services of an IVF clinic. So IVF clinics will often say traditional surrogacy isn't legal. Again, that's not true. It just means that they cannot assist. And a lot of clinics, even outside of Victoria, will have a policy that they won't assist with traditional surrogacy, usually because they have an idea that traditional surrogacy is more risky, either because the surrogate won't hand over the baby or because she's going to bond more with the baby. My experience and the experience of the surrogates that I talk to is that we don't actually bond with the baby regardless of the genetic connection that we may or may not have with that child. What we attach to is the idea that the intended parents are going to be the parents of that baby. That's really what we're hoping for, regardless of whether we share genetics with the child. It is a bit more complex though, because traditional surrogacy means that the surrogate has a genetic connection with that child. So she has a different relationship with the child as they grow up and understand their connections with the surrogate and perhaps with her children and any other children, like in my case, where I've donated my eggs, for example. Traditional surrogacy, while it's legal and while clinics often won't help, generally involves home inseminations, which is all sorts of awkward and fun. I get it. I've done it. It's a bit awkward. The good news is, though, that the process for parentage is exactly the same as gestational surrogacy. So everybody still needs to qualify for surrogacy. That might be that the intended parents can't carry or are at risk if they try and carry their own pregnancy. And then everybody does counselling and gets legal advice. And there's usually a written surrogacy agreement between them that they all sign before they go ahead with the conception attempts. So if you're thinking about doing traditional surrogacy and thinking, oh, we don't need the lawyers and counsellors, that's not true. You still need to do the counselling and the legal advice before the conception attempts. And then the pregnancy is just like any other pregnancy. And when she gives birth, the surrogate relinquishes the child to the intended parents, and then they apply for a parentage order in their home state. And that parentage order doesn't really rely on any information about the genetics. It's just to do with whether or not the parties did their counselling and legal advice. So traditional surrogacy is just the same in that regard. From a legal perspective, the child goes home with the intended parents. They do the legal process for parentage to have themselves established as the parents and to be listed on the child's birth certificate. It just happens that the person that gave birth also shares genetics with that child. If you're thinking about doing traditional surrogacy, keep in mind that 85% of my arrangements involve gestational surrogacy. If you're looking for a surrogate and an egg donor, you're more likely to find an egg donor than you are to find a traditional surrogate, and that might be a better option for you. Traditional surrogacy, because it's so complex and because it's the same legal process, it's not a good idea to do it just because you're hoping to save on the cost of IVF. But absolutely, if somebody has said, I'd like to be a traditional surrogate, that's fine. They can do that. There are other videos I've got that talk about the process of surrogacy and who can become a surrogate. You're welcome to have a watch. If you have any questions, you might find the answers on the blog or in the Surrogacy podcast, which are both on my website at sarahjefford.com. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to email me, hello@sarahjefford.com.